This is GUWEIZ, an illustrator of over 11 years that has quickly managed to garner a massive following due to his dark and expansive illustrations, always leaving an impression on the viewer that there is more than initially meets the eyes in these vast cities and complex characters. But what has always intrigued me the most about his works is the simplicity. Simple? What about his works looks simple? I know it sounds crazy, but zooming into a lot of his works, you can see how simple he's able to make these details while still masterfully creating a realistic scene. This skill, paired with his ability to tell stories through still photos, has captivated me to the point of buying both his books and Patreon to learn his ways. To best explain things, I'll be splitting this study into two sections. This video will be going over his entire process and rendering technique, how he technically makes the work. The next one will be going over his composition and narrative, how he plans his work. Most of the information in this study will be from his most recent book, The World of GUWEIZ, the appearance that he made in the book Mastering Color and Light, and his Patreon, all of which I highly recommend you get for a more expansive look into this. Links in the description. So in order to study how he makes his paintings, we first have to, well, see how he makes his paintings. But the problem with that is while his process is shown in the books and Patreon, I couldn't find any real time lapses outside of his YouTube, and I'm way too broke to get his Colosso. And seeing as I wouldn't want to use an 8-year-old video as an example, I'll be doing a complete master study following the process he describes in the sources I already listed. I'll be doing this using this piece, not insanely complex as I mostly just want to get the process down, but a big thing with this piece is that he posted his work in progress for it, so I have something to cross-reference, and as you'll see later, that'll be very helpful. I'll be breaking down his process from Photoshop into my own software of choice, Clip Studio Paint, not sponsored. There is only one singular brush I will be using this entire time, the good old trusty round brush, specifically the round brush inside of GUWEIZ's Patreon pack. 95% of these paintings were made using this, and the other 5 consisted of the default blur, blend, and airbrush inside of Clip Studio. But without further ado, let's get into the study of GUWEIZ. Starting off, if there's one way I would describe this process, it would be the phrase simple, but not. You'll see what I mean. As described in the books and in the work in progress, the process starts much like any other, with a rough but decently complete sketch, with most of the important marks like the focal point, character, and big objects defined. Then GUWEIZ skips the line art and goes straight into the local values. Yes, you heard me right. This is a one and done. This process includes no line art. Depending on your style though, you could change this and make the lines clean. However, if we want speed and consider the looseness of the later steps, I suggest just going straight from the sketch to the rest of the painting. Moving on, we block in the local values, this being the value of the color that should be on each part of the painting. No actual coloring yet. Working in value can be very useful instead of going straight into color, as it allows you to get a rough idea of how the shapes and lighting will be blocked in before worrying about secondary things like color too early. But again, things may vary depending on the artist, but we'll get into that later. After the base values, we establish the lighting of the piece, keeping things pretty zoomed out as we're still pretty rough and have no real need to sweat on the small details. At this point, we should have a rough blocking of the values and the light. So we continue to render the more detailed parts of the illustration, not going to render small things like the eyes or the nose, but putting in secondary shades and lighting and adding more into the scene if it's more than just a character. At this point, we should be mostly done with the values, and we can take a step back and look at the painting as a whole. Is it too bright, too dark? If the lighting looks off but it's in the right places, instead of repainting it, just adjust the brightness using the curve tool. In Clip Studio Paint, not sponsored but wouldn't mind one, you can do this by going to Edit, Tonal Correction, and Tone Curve. In this tool, you can select and move around this curve, which will affect the brightness of the selected layer. Keywords selected layer, which means that the less layers you have, the easier this will be. Now, with a pretty good value range and a rough sketch on top, it's time to add color. GUWEIZ adds local colors to the illustrations using the soft light layer setting, just making a new layer with that setting on top and clipping it on top of whatever you want to color. This leads to a pretty desaturated palette, but we're just getting started. Now, to get the mood down, the entire painting needs to be a lot cooler, especially considering that we have this strong blue lighting coming from the left side. Keep in mind that at this point, everything should be merged into 2 layers, one for the character and one for the background. Yes, GUWEIZ unironically does this. Duplicate the layers and on them adjust the colors using the color balance tool. To do this in Clip Studio, waiting on that sponsor, going back into edit and tonal correction, and then it's right there with all the other stuff. This tool allows you to select the shadow, midtones, or highlights and edit the colors accordingly. However, color balance changes the entire painting into that blue hue, and this is why we duplicated those layers. Just erase the parts you don't want to be as blue and then merge everything once you're done. At this point, all that's left to do is render. Wait, what? That's it? But we're nowhere near the finished piece. What do you mean just render? Simple but not, my friend. Simple but not. So at this point in the process, I was feeling quite confused and like I had like a huge, giant, daunting task ahead of me because I know all that's left is to render, but it's so far from that finished product. Looking back at GUWEIZ's own work in progress for this piece, everything makes sense and goes in order until you reach that 4th step, and then it looks like he shows you steps 9 and 10. But again, I'll never know until I try it. So here goes nothing. At this point, I'm just working from big to small. I realized the head and hand were too small, so I make them bigger and fill in the gaps. Then I spent about half an hour carving away at the hair and the head. This leads me to one of my big GUWEIZ rendering tips: abuse that blur tool, especially in places like the skin and the clothes. When working with something like this round brush, it's easy to try and color pick and blend with just the brush and do that over and over again until something kind of looks smooth. And while that does work in places like hair and sometimes in some pieces of clothing, when you try it in everything like the skin and smoother materials, you end up with things looking very samey and muddy in the texture department. So if you want skin to look like real skin and cloth to look like cloth, then you need to use the blur and blend tool along with your round brush. Balance smooth and hard edges, it just makes everything look more interesting. Getting back into it, I just look around at things that I feel like need more clarity and paint them out, such as areas in the hair, defining the braids a bit more, adding stripes to the uniform, and eventually ending up at something that's similar to the 5th painting in his process. And this leads me to my second big tip. Don't be afraid of making big changes. In so many of GUWEIZ's work in progresses seen on his Patreon, I see so many points where he's on his 5th or even 6th panel and almost completely done with the piece, and then he just makes a huge change in the composition, something that I had no idea about before and honestly really respect him for. He's not afraid to change big things even when it's only on 2 or 3 layers. Not afraid to test out a solution when he sees something wrong rather than just trusting the process. Things like the case on her back, the tattoos, the entire monster in the background are things GUWEIZ didn't even include in the first 3 steps and only added later on because, well, he just felt like they would make the piece better. Heading back into the study, at this point I'm actually feeling quite good. A complete 180 from the previous point. It was surprisingly not that difficult to just paint on top because the key features were already figured out in the previous steps, and it's just a matter of finally bothering to zoom in a bit. And as you're seeing now, we're just putting in a bunch of the final details. To be quite honest, I was also quite surprised at how simple this last part was. There's no complicated layer structure. Oh, you have to do this and then that and then set this to clip onto that in order to get the glow just right. All I do is add a single layer on top, paint on that, maybe set it to overlay or color dodge when I want to adjust some colors, and merge it when it looks good, rinse and repeat, and then blur the background. And there we go. We're done. Well, not really, because for some reason my drawing tablet likes to play tricks on me, so while I'm drawing it, it looks good, but when I export it, and probably as you're seeing during the time lapse, it looks way brighter than the reference. But no big deal. All I did was just go back into tone curve and color balance and then adjust some things, make it a little bit darker, a little bit more blue, and that's it. Didn't get it on camera, but it was like 2 minutes of work. So with a finally adjusted painting, there we go. Voila, study complete. While the study was a success, especially considering it only took about 6 hours, I only really got to tell you like 2 tips. And what kind of person would I be to only leave you with 2 measly painting tips? So in this segment, I'm gonna give you 5 tips that I would call the GUWEIZ. Totally not the name I took from his books. The first 2 I already went over: smooth versus hard edges and not being afraid to make big changes. The third is references. This entire post, while I don't have the exact reference here, GUWEIZ himself describes as having the reference of pretty much the exact same pose. Of course with different clothes and light and everything else, but everything derives from reference. The only reason I was able to emulate GUWEIZ to this degree with a single brush in 6 hours is because I had the perfect reference right in front of me the entire time: the final product. The name of the game when making something that isn't a study is finding the right references to match the pose, the mood, and whatever else you have in mind. Use your intuition and then fill in the gaps for the rest. The fourth tip is to keep it simple, stupid. The big theme in this entire study is how simple things were. One brush and a few default blend tools. No, you don't need one brush for the hair, and then one brush for the skin, and then one for the clothes, and then 100 more for all the different materials that exist on Earth, except for the rig brush. That one is pretty good. But my point is, you only need like 3 brushes max to do 95 to 99% of the work. Same thing with the layers. You only need like 5 to 10 depending on the piece. And if you're being really simple and you're just making a character with a simple background, no effects or extra objects or anything, you only need 2 layers. Merge that line art with the color layer. I dare you. The fifth and final tip is to ignore the process. That entire segment right after the intro, not really needed. Sure, if you like working in grayscale, it is a legitimate way to make paintings, and lots of highly popular masters paint in this way, such as Wop and GUWEIZ. That first process is pretty much a guide on how GUWEIZ does that entire first part, going from grayscale to color. But I'm not GUWEIZ, and I'm sure a lot of you aren't him either. I honestly feel like I lose a lot of control over what I'm making when I start in grayscale, and would rather just put a grayscale layer on top of everything and then adjust things that way so I can work more with the color early on. But that's not something I realized until I did this last segment. Now it's time to put my actual skills to the test and paint using the GUWEIZ I just gave y'all. I won't be emulating his style in this sense, I just want to see if I can apply what I learned while making this video into my own work, and not really try to copy the signature GUWEIZ realism. So starting out, I had a pretty good idea in mind, mostly inspired by this piece I just randomly saw on Twitter, and I wanted to do a theme of an angelic sunset. With that idea in mind, I collected a few more references and got to work on completing the sketch without much trouble, and then did the values. You don't need me to explain this again, but this is when I ran into a wall. How do I turn this into color? This is much more colorful than the study that I did, and it felt kind of like a mistake to start in grayscale, but I ended up settling with some gradient maps and other things that I won't get into details for, because at this point it was 1 AM and I was getting eepy. So I wake up, I look at it, and what is that? What was I on last night? Because this looks rough. TLDR, tried to save it, the resuscitation was not working, mouth to mouth was not mouthing, and I decided to scrap it. I still think the idea was good, and I probably will remake it in the second half of the year when I'm bored, and I even like the sketch, and I think the composition is decent, but I feel like fundamental things were off with the colors, and I couldn't exactly get a clear idea of where to take it. So that's going on the bench for now. For attempt number 2, I decided to do things a bit differently, less study and environment oriented, and more leaning towards the types of things that I usually like to do. The subject here was free run because yes, and I wanted to do a callback to that one scene with the purple stuff because everyone knows about that one scene with the purple stuff. So again, back to the sketch, I wanted to be as nonchalant as possible. I ended up with the idea of her trying to touch her own magic because it's purple, shiny, and I guess potentially lethal, but she's just a chill girl. Ignore me fumbling this hand for about 10 minutes, and there we go. I like the sketch. I was like, screw that grayscale stuff, I'm just gonna do my own thing. Proceeded to do my own thing, and then went back to sleep. I woke up, booted up that tablet, and what do you know, it actually looks pretty good, so I'm just gonna keep on going with this. Oh, and I finally remembered to turn on OBS again so I could screen record this entire thing. I don't know why I forgot to do that. I'm a little stupid, I'm a dum-dum. So getting back into this piece, at this point we're pretty much at the rendering stage, which brings me back to my point. The process to get here doesn't really matter. The one that GUWEIZ uses is a perfectly fine way to do things, especially if you like painting in grayscale and converting it into colors, but if you don't like that process and it feels more natural to paint in the colors yourself, then by all means do whatever you want. What's really important is treating the rendering stage like GUWEIZ would. At this stage, I've divided everything into 4 layers, 1 for the background, 1 for the character, and 2 for the effects on top and bottom. Now I'm just doing the same thing I did back in the rendering section of this video, painting on top of areas I feel like need immediate correction, mainly focusing on focal points like the face, hair, and upper torso, trying to get a good foundation in. I will say I did get pretty lucky with this piece as everything was kind of in a pretty good spot from the very beginning, which does not happen very often in my other works or even just the master study. I'm mostly exclusively sticking to the GUWEIZ round brush, mixing in a bit of rake brushes and other stuff that I have here and there, but eventually all of it kind of gets painted over anyways. Every time I see something that I'm not completely sure about, I just bring up a new reference off screen, so just for her clothes, staff, hair, whatnot. But let's not stress out on the details and cut to the chase. I added a few gradient maps here and there, some correction layers on top, and we're done. Not bad at all, especially considering the time to make it was only a bit under 6 hours. So what are my final thoughts on the GUWEIZ style? A lot more straightforward than I realized. I knew it wasn't going to be rocket science or anything, but so much of it was pretty much all intuition, a few brushes, and very few layers. To put things into context, to go from base sketch to colors, the entire process part of this video took about an hour and 45 minutes. From that point on, everything was merged into 2 layers, and to go from that to the finished product was about 4 hours. Less than 1/3 of the painting actually took any kind of quote-unquote process. Now obviously this will vary wildly depending on what you want to create. If you're making something like a city or with lots of repeatable objects, I'm sure you're going to spend a lot more time sketching and figuring out the initial steps. But eventually you just need to take a step back, merge everything, and give into the chaos of pure instinct, one brush, just do whatever you want, it's just a painting little bro lifestyle. It's funny how you start off not using layers because you don't know how, and then once you learn a bit about them, you're suddenly looking at a painting that took 50 layers with a single character and background, and then you go full circle and realize 2 layers was kinda all you really needed in the end. I'm sure not a lot of you will get exactly what I mean right now. A lot of this stuff is pretty advanced, especially when it comes to stuff like trusting your instincts while you render. I mean, what kind of art instinct do you have when you just started out? This isn't stuff I've understood until recently, and I'm over 4 years into this art thing. But I hope this is the kind of video that some of you can come back to years down the line and be like, oh, so this is what he meant by using the blur tool in the right way, or something like that, and then comment about it in the future and stroke my metaphorically huge future ego. But that wraps up my GUWEIZ study. Again, go check out his stuff. It's helped me grow a lot over the past few years. I hope you guys look forward to the next video, and I'll catch y'all in the next one.